Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of background. Bat Week is coming up here. It's going the end of October, as I'm sure you're probably aware of. We were trying to do kind of a whole campaign and just really educate our audiences about bats and OSMRE and different bat activity and things like that. So if you don't mind, would you mind just introducing yourself? Tell me a little bit about yourself and essentially what you do at OSMRE and how that, your experience and education in bat and ecology.
Sure, sure. My name's Craig Walker. I'm an ecologist here with Office of Surface Mining Reclamation Enforcement. Been working for the agency for almost 36 years now, and I've been in this position as an ecologist for almost 18 years. And so I've been working with bats from the beginning of that 18-year period, almost from the start. I've done quite a bit of work with bats in various aspects of how we as OSMRE get involved, how they come into play when as it relates to surface mining. Um, we do a lot of what we do is working with our state partners to develop guidelines for the development of protection and enhancement plans, because whenever a mine is permitted, especially in the East and Midwest, if there are trees involved on the mine, of course, on a surface mine, those trees are going to be removed. So most bats live in trees, at least during the summer. And so and several of these bats are on the endangered species list. So the Endangered Species List requires that, or the Endangered Species Act requires that that be taken into account, and that they're either what we've done in order to comply with the act, what operators do and state regulatory authorities do is we require them to do a survey to find out if the bats are there, and if they're not there, of course, then they don't have to do anything. But of course, if they do find bats, then they have to prepare a protection enhancement plan and do a variety of mitigation measures to account for the lost habitat and the potential impact to bats and their habitat. An alternative to doing a survey is just to assume presence. So they can also just assume presence. And if they do that, then it's the same process. They prepare a protection enhancement plan, and it has all these different aspects like habitat enhancement, mitigation strategies, not cutting the trees during a certain period of the year when the bats and their babies are in the trees, that sort of thing. So a lot of the work that I have done and still do goes into developing those plans, looking at those plans that SRAs submit, and commenting on that and that sort of thing. As well, me and myself and my partner, another ecologist named Brian Daly in our Pittsburgh, also in the regional office in Pittsburgh, we have conducted some bat research, primarily using acoustic monitoring devices. Bats navigate, as most people I'm sure they know, they forage at night, and they use ultrasound. They emit ultrasonic sounds to navigate and also to find prey at night. And these sounds are somewhat species specific. So there have been monitors that have been developed that can acoustic monitors that can record these sounds, and you can run them through software and tell which species they are and whether they're present on your site. So it's a non-invasive, non-stressful way of sampling bats. But we've also, we don't do, there's also another method of surveying called mist netting, which is where you put up a net with very fine mesh in it that bats usually don't see or don't detect. And then they get entangled in these nets. You take them out and you identify them, measure them, take data, and then let them go. That is something that requires a lot of manpower and is done at night because that's when they're foraging. So it takes several people. They have to work overnight. It's a lot more labor intensive. You can, with these monitors, you can just go set them out on a site, leave them there for as long as you want, as long as the batteries will last, really, but not generally that long. But for long periods of time, then you have a whole wealth of data, over time that you can analyze. So a couple things like that. And I've been involved with other, there are a number of organizations that are composed of bat researchers, like Southeastern Bat Diversity Network, Tennessee Bat Working Group, attending a lot of those meetings, and those organizations also have what they call bat blitzes once a year. Now the pandemic has put a crimp in that the last couple of years, but before that they would have a blitz every year, and the blitz is an event where a whole bunch of bat biologists from states, federal, nonprofits, consultants all converge on one area and go out at night and do mist netting for like 3 nights in a row and capture the bats. And it's usually on some sort of public land, like a U.S. Forest Service land or State Wildlife Management Agency land, state park, U.S. National Forest, something like that. So that gives the management agency a whole bunch of data that they would have a hard time collecting on their own if we didn't do that. So those are highly beneficial to the management agencies, as well as a whole lot of fun to do, because it's a big gathering of bat biologists, and it's a big fun event, and also it's really amazing to see bats, have them in your hand, and hold a bat. Very few people have ever actually held a bat in their hand, and it's a really incredible experience. And bats are incredible animals, and I would encourage people to just learn about. Just go look. If you just look at like a bat's anatomy, they're like a human hand. In fact, the scientific order that they're in, the Latin name translates to winged hand. So they're very similar in anatomy to people. It's really interesting, and their ultrasound, of course, is very interesting, and how they forage and how they raise their babies, and how they hibernate and all that stuff. But of course, any discussion of bats these days has to include white nose syndrome, and that pathogen arrived here, oh gosh, what is it? Probably 2006. So we've been living with it for 15 years or so now, and has decimated the populations of a couple of species of bats, and is threatening some others. So it's a huge issue that we've been struggling with, and we've lost a lot of bats to over the last 10, 15 years. And it has really put a dent in just the numbers of bats that we find in general. We used to find lots and lots of bats, like at these blitzes, and certain species, of course, especially, that we just hardly find or don't find at all anymore. So, excuse me, that's one of the sort of the sad realities of bat work these days. But I think that's about all I can think of it right now, unless you have questions.
I do actually have quite a couple. So we were talking about white nose syndrome and essentially the problems that it's causes. Is there anything that your everyday persons should know about white nose syndrome? Whether it's essentially, aside from staying out of identified mine shafts and caves, or if bats reside somewhere, to leave them alone. Is there any other information? Or I mean, there's probably a ton of explorers out there who are, home spelunkers or climbers. I've been reading a little bit about like cleaning gear. Do you have any recommendations for people who may encounter bats and run into these situations where they're around bats that have white nose syndrome?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of these caves especially, are on public land, and most of them are closed and gated to public access for safety, but also, since white nose, they've been closed to for that reason as well. But if you do happen to go into a cave, or if you're climbing on a cliff and happen to see something wedged in a crevice, the main thing is just leave it alone. Don't touch it. Don't disturb it. Try to be as quiet. as possible, because generally when you run into bats in caves, not all, I mean, some bats live in caves in the summertime and in the wintertime, but generally the ones that are in caves are in the wintertime, and what they're doing in there is hibernating. And they're in a state called torpor, and it's not, I don't think it's true hibernation, but anyway, they're in a state called torpor, and it's basically a deep sleep where their metabolism slows way down, and they're able to exist over the winter without feeding. When they're aroused from that torpor by disturbance, as say a caver or somebody walks through and shines a light on them, makes a lot of noise, or actually touches them, then that arousal causes their metabolism to ramp back up to its normal level, and that depletes their fat reserves, and those fat reserves are what enable them to go through the winter. Because probably the main reason they're hibernating in the wintertime is because they eat insects, and insects aren't on the landscape for the most part in wintertime. So if they're disturbed, then they use up that fat, and then they may not make it through the winter, and it will kill them. But that's the other thing that, that also white nose does, is it sort of causes them to wake up, and they use up that fat reserve and they die. But human disturbance is another factor, another avenue that they can wake up and use up their fat reserves and die. So, and cleaning gear, disinfecting. If you do go into caves, because you can get it, it can be in the soil, it can be in the substrate of the cave or whatever. So yeah, there are disinfection protocols out there for gear, and it's very, very important to disinfect between visits, especially between caves or mines. Or you shouldn't go into abandoned mine shafts at all, ever. But if you go into a cave that, where that's allowed, then you just should definitely be disinfecting your gear afterwards.
Gotcha. Going into leading into mine shafts, I am curious. So underground mining, it's my understanding that some underground mines have just the right circumstances to really for bad ecology and environments. Can you tell me a little bit about why what underground mines, or what makes a really good environment that mine shafts work so well to house bats?
Well, they basically simulate natural caves. I mean, they're the sort of the adit, the type of mine that goes in sort of horizontally into a coal seam into the side of a mountain. Basic, and of course, shaft mines, they'll live in shaft mines too, which are basically vertical holes in the ground. And there's a lot of caves that are vertical holes in the ground. But when you go underground, there's two or three parameters that have to be in the right range, and one of them is temperature. They like a certain temperature, like it somewhat cold. And different species like different areas of the cave or the mine. They'll like, some of them like a little bit warmer, some of them like a little bit colder. There has to be airflow, just right, and the humidity has to be just right. So those three things there, if a mine shaft simulates a cave to the extent that those factors are similar enough to be good habitat, good hibernating and or roosting habitat for bats, then they can and will sometimes live in those caves. I mean, in those mines. So that it's basically a man-made cave, human-made cave, that they're living in these mines. But again, and most of them are abandoned. Well, they should be abandoned. Of course, since the passage of SMRE, the Surface Mine Control Reclamation Act, they have to be abandoned mine. No longer used mine openings have to be sealed and covered up and reclaimed. So the abandoned mine opening, mine openings that bats are living in today are ones that were abandoned pre-law. So, and they're all over the landscape, especially in the east and especially in some of the eastern states. And well, they're all over the country actually, but here in the east, they're all over Appalachia. There's a lot of abandoned mine shafts. So one of the things that abandoned mine land programs do is they install gates, bat-friendly gates in these mines, and that's an important aspect of ensuring that we keep some of our bats if they're utilizing these abandoned mine openings. Sometimes we'll survey and see if they're there or not in order to decide whether they put in a gate. Most of the time, they'll just go put in a gate. They'll gate these openings, and there's a lot that goes into. We've learned a lot over the years about gates. The gating technology has improved to the point that we think we know now the right materials to use, the right space between the openings, the horizontal openings, and that sort of thing. To make sure that they can navigate, they can detect the gate with their ultrasound, and get through in and out easily. So there's a lot of been a lot of effort put into developing this technology on the one hand, and also to installing it by our the abandoned mine programs in our state partner.
Gotcha. So I just a one more question, I guess, unless, well, I actually have a ton of questions.
Well, I'm here, man. Whatever
I learned about bats, I was like, oh, I want to know about this, or I want to ask him about this. I guess the next big
I love to talk.
Yeah. I guess the next big question I have is just like, one of the things that bugs me about when I think about understanding bats in general is I get frustrated. I know because I live in the Northeast, and every time I hear someone getting upset about mosquitoes or bugs or pests, their first thought is pesticides, where I feel like they should be, really they should be thinking bats and bat houses, and how to promote bats living in their area. So essentially, how much or what do bats do for our environment? I mean, whether it's because it's my understanding they save farmers a ton of money when it comes to pesticides, but also pollination. So, what do bats do for our ecology that we may take for granted?
Well, that you're getting into a whole field that's called ecosystem services, and bats are a very integral part of our ecosystem. They cohabitate with us in our ecosystem, and they provide these services to humans that a lot of people are completely unaware of. And pest control is a major one. They do eat a lot of mosquitoes. There are various estimates, but it can be quite a few in one night. Installing bat houses is a great thing that people can do. There's two things, though, that if you're going to put in a bat house, you have to think about. One is the bat house itself, how it's constructed. Bats are very picky about where they live, and you can't just slap a bat house up anywhere and have them move in. It won't happen. Trust me, I know, because I've got one. I've had 16 years on the side of a barn out here, not one bat ever. So the bat house has to be properly constructed, and there you can find those on the internet. Bat Conservation International is a great website to go to for all kinds of information related to bats. If you have bats in your house, how to humanely exclude them, how to attract them, that sort of thing. They eat a lot of bugs, but and for instance, down in Texas, there are these free-tailed bats that are number in the millions, and they eat a pest called the corn earworm, which there have been estimates. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but that saved corn farmers millions and millions, if not billions of dollars in pest control costs, because they just swarm. When there's so many of these bats, you can see them on radar, and they eat a lot of corn earworms. So it really they're a huge benefit to the farmers. And there's some caves down in Texas, Bracken Cave, for instance, that is owned by Bat Conservation International, where you can go during the summer and see these bats right at dusk just boil out of this cave for 45 minutes to an hour or longer. Sometimes they go out for and then they come back later. But and the guano in the cave is several feet deep. woods so deep. In fact, they used to mine it there, use it for fertilizer. They don't do. I don't think they do that much anymore in this country. They may do it elsewhere in the world. But so the I got off track there. The making sure the house is correctly constructed and then correctly located is another thing. They like houses, bad houses, to be with a lot of solar radiation during the day, so south facing. They like sort of a particular type of forest structure, sort of like in an opening in the forest with trees around, you know, where they can day roost, and then or where they can perch or whatever, and then you know, a lot of solar radiation so that the babies can stay warm during the day. That's generally what they're doing in the houses, is raising pups in the summertime. So yeah, a lot of ecosystem services. You mentioned pollination. The bats pollinate the agave plant, which is where tequila comes from. So no bats, no tequila is what I always say. You know, and fruit bats and around the world, you know, flying foxes and things like that in Australia and other parts of Asia are big pollinators too as well. So yeah, they're a very important part of our ecosystem, and we should definitely be protecting them and not persecuting them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I just the little research I did just to talk to you today. I was absolutely amazed at how much they do for our ecology, our
Yeah.
environment, our livelihoods. So with it's my understanding we have a article on our website about the Flight 93 site and some of the acoustic monitoring there. But we don't have any. I don't have any newer information or updates since that article went out. How's that going? Is there new data that came from that? What is? Do you know of anything that or how it's going essentially?
That article on the website was a project that we did primarily. My colleague Brian Daly was the lead on that, and he did most of the work on that. And we found several species that were using what we were surveying there. They have that site, Flight 93, was a surface mine, so there are some sediment ponds on there that were controlling runoff, and there's producing acid mine drainage, and so there are a couple ponds that have orange water, a lot high iron, probably high acid. I don't remember the pH, but definitely high iron because they're very orange. And then there's one pond that doesn't have that drainage. It's just regular surface runoff, you know, clean water. So we compared those two and found some differences in the species occurrence. But basically, it was just looking at you know, trying sort of exploratory to see what was there. Now we do have a program, but we have a thing where we our division, technical services division in Pittsburgh, we have, I think, 10 acoustic monitors that we loan out to other agencies, state agencies or federal agencies. And so what we have done is we have loaned several monitors to the National Park Service, and they're using them for their research. They're going to be I think there was some sort of event, maybe since this was the 20th year anniversary of 9/11, but they're monitoring and at Flight 93 and three other National Park Service sites in Pennsylvania, Johnstown Flood and a couple of others. So they're setting those monitors out, and they're out right now. So they're collecting data right now, and they'll send us their report when that gets finished. But that'll be a while before we get any more data on that. But that's what's been happening at Flight 93.
Gotcha. Okay. I am curious. So, is there essentially? I'm getting to the end of my list of questions so far. Is there anything that you want the world to know, or anything we didn't talk about that we should really highlight about bat conservation or Bat Week in general?
Well, just that I think it's most of the things we've already touched on. OSM is involved in bat conservation. You know, we're very proactive and on top of looking at the effects surface mines have on bats and making sure those effects are mitigated. Bats are amazing. You know, you should learn all you can about bats because they They're just incredible. You know, we should conserve, like we talked about, ecosystem services, pest control, you know, tequila, that sort of thing. You know, just, you know, just the message should be conserve, you know, protect, don't persecute, that sort of thing. You know, they're an essential, integral part of our world, and we don't want to lose them. Yeah. We have lost quite a few. A couple species are down 90-95% because of white nose, you know. So they're really in trouble. They're on the ropes, and we should be doing everything we can to help them.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sitting with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Nice meeting you. And like I said, anytime you have any questions about anything biologically related, just let me know.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. This has been enlightening, and it was great talking with you. Hopefully one day, if I'm ever out in the Pittsburgh area, I'll get to stop by and say hi once this whole COVID thing dies down.
Well, I'm in Knoxville, but you should stop by and say hi to Brian.